some follow-up talks, and I've agreed to do 3. I think I'm doing 1 a month. I have to say I'm very impressed with the number of people there are at 8 a.m. I wasn't sure we were going to get anybody coming, so thank you for dialing in. I'm going to talk about 3 things today. I'm going to talk about credibility, and there's going to be one on trust, and there's going to be one on influence. They're sort of interrelated topics. So for example, trust is sometimes defined in terms of credibility, and credibility sometimes in terms of trust. So it's difficult to pull them apart separately, and there will be a little bit of cross-referencing, but nevertheless, I think it's still worth about talking about each one of them. I'm probably going to talk about for about 15-20 minutes, no longer than that. The stuff I'm going to talk about today has 3 sources. Now, one of them is obviously myself. There's a certain amount of my own views and experience in this, so feel free to take it all with a pinch of salt and put your own spin on and agree with what you agree with, and throw out what you don't find useful. There has been some proper research in some of it, which was done for books, but also most you probably don't know, but I'm also doing a master's in epistemology, theory of knowledge in the background, and that has quite a lot on trust. I'm quite interested in the theories of trust, so there is some sort of academic stuff as well building on it, not so much in credibility. So let's jump into credibility. Well, what is credibility to begin with? And there are lots of definitions. The one I quite like, and I think it's the one that's most useful to us, is it's the believability of a source of information. And I think we can extend that in the work that we do into not just being information, but the actions and the things we do and the things we try and influence people to do. So are we believable in them? So are we credible? Why is it important to us? Always a good question, although I imagine most of us know this, and looking round the profile of the people here, and please don't take this the wrong way, I'm going to judge that most people have got a reasonable amount of experience looking at your pictures. So might feel we don't need to answer this, but it's worth just talking about it for a second. I mean, the reason credibility is particularly important to us is we're generally not going to get work without credibility. Clients are certainly not going to rock up and pay us hundreds of pounds a day, in some cases more, for us if we're not credible. The other thing is, it's not really just about getting in the door, it's about our ongoing experience at a client and the way we work. And I think we're not going to be listened to, and we're not going to be able to be impactful at clients if we don't have credibility. And I suspect all of us at some time have at least seen somebody else at a client who's not credible, and sometimes may have experienced it ourselves, where the client is doubting our credibility, and it just makes our lives a lot harder. So credibility is like one of those bedrock things we need with our client, both to get in the door in the first place and to keep working. I think the most important thing, this is probably the most important thing I'm going to say this morning, is credibility is related to how credible you deserve to be, but it isn't the same thing. I mean, credibility is essentially a perception. It's a perception in the mind of our clients. And there can be a gap, sometimes quite a significant gap, both positive or negative, between how credible a client perceives us to be and how credible we may feel we deserve to be. And again, reflect back on your own experience, and I'm sure you will have known people in your career who you've thought, gosh, that person is really brilliant at what they do, but for some reason or other, clients don't really treat them as brilliant, and they're not credible. And unfortunately, and certainly any of us who've got experience from the big consultancies, we'll have met people who probably don't deserve the credibility they have, the sort of the charlatans and the bullshit merchants who sometime get away with it. Now, there's a cynical response to the fact that there's a gap between how much credibility you deserve and how much you are perceived to be. And that cynical response is, well, all I need to worry about is the client perception. I don't need to worry about how much I deserve to be. And although it's not a direct analogy, I sometimes think the sort of Richard Branson fake it till I make it is a sort of slightly cynical, I personally think slightly unethical view of working with your clients. But I do believe that in the longer run, the best way to be perceived to be credible is to have a strong basis for that credibility, but I also think it's not the same thing. So let's talk about those in 2 different ways. Let's talk a little bit about why we deserve credibility, and then separately, why people perceive us as being credible. And why we deserve credibility is because we're competent. Basically, we're competent at the things we do, but we also have an ability to apply that competence in a way that is meaningful for the client. And, you know, the best analogy I can think of for this is something like, you know, we will know people who know lots of great stuff, but they can't teach anybody else it because they can't apply it. And there is a thing about credibility needs to rely on basically competence and ability to apply that competence. So how do we make ourselves credible? Well, let's look about the deserving side, and certainly the way we flag our deserving. I think, you know, if we all go back to the starts of our careers, certainly for me, that's a long time ago, but when I can just about remember it, I think the sort of focus in those early days is on what we might call the badges that give us credibility, and things I call badges anyway. And the most obvious sorts of badges are things like degrees. Have you got a degree? Or probably for most of us, things like professional accreditations. So like many of you, I have some professional accreditations. Mine are what I might call fairly light professional accreditations, either things I've gone off and done a few days courses in various project management and change management things. Some of you may well have some fairly significant accreditations. If you've got a proper coaching qualification, that tends to be a fairly, you know, significant and important accreditation. It tends to be a serious piece of work. The interesting thing about these badges is actually, I don't know about you, but my general experience is clients don't care about them. Yeah. So, you know, I've got degrees, clients, I've never asked, clients never asked to see a degree. I've once or twice had a client ask something like, have you got ProSci or ProSci, I'm never sure of the pronunciation, change management accreditation? And probably 20 years ago, they might have asked, have you got Prince2? And maybe sometimes they ask nowadays, have you got, you know, Agile Safe accreditation? But I actually think it's a fairly, at best, a helping aid rather than something important. And I think for us in credibility, it's obviously much more about our known track record in doing what we do. Have we done it N times before? And the more specifically that N times before relates to our client specific need, probably the better. And the way we advertise that is typically in the tool of our trade, or the tool of our door opening part of our trade, our profiles and our CVs and things like that, we write down all creds and experience. As a complete aside, I've never really analysed it, but I'm always interested in how different areas want different sorts of CVs. So in our field, it tends to be that sort of one-page profile. It's quite different if you're kind of being marketed by contractor agents who tend to want that sort of 25-page CV with everything. No, they don't. Oh, interesting. Someone saying they don't. Well, my experience is that they maybe they shouldn't, but they often do seem to want that, and lots of things like that. And versus if you wanted a permanent job CV. But anyway, ways of showing our credibility. Now, better than any of those, I think it tends to be things like referrals and references. And the reason why a referral is particularly helpful is when you analyze it, is because to some extent trust and credibility go with it. So if, you know, Mary knows Dave and Dave comes to Mary and says, I'm looking for an expert in X, and Mary says, well, I know someone, worked with Fred 5 times, he's brilliant at Salesforce implementations or whatever else it is, then to some extent Mary's credibility is transitioned onto Fred, and that's particularly helpful for you. As an aside, it's also why we ought to be careful giving references too often as well, because not only do they carry trust and credibility, they carry distrust and discredibility, in the sense that if you keep referring people who aren't actually very good, it will come back and it damages the attitude people have to yours. So we've got all these things that enable us to show our credibility, but underlying it, what builds it up is our track record in which we've built our competence and in which we've shown that competence, we can apply it to clients. Okay, that's kind of the easy stuff. And actually that's the stuff we tend to be focused on. What is it that makes clients perceive us as competent? And I think, to me, the best way of showing this is kind of by an example, which is not really from our field. I'm not going to actually ask you a question because it never really works in these quick webinars, but imagine we were sitting in a room and asked you a question, who is the greatest, or who was the greatest scientist of the 20th century? Who was the greatest scientist of the 20th century? Now, some of you may say something like, I don't know, Marie Curie, double Nobel Prize winner, World War I hero, all the rest, or you might say Stephen Hawking. But my expectation is more often than not, you'd probably say Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein, the greatest scientist of the 20th century. And I suspect very few of you, unless you're a theoretical physicist, would say Paul Dirac, who's a person who's probably slightly lost in the history of time. Now, I'm not a physicist, but I've read that Paul Dirac was possibly as great a scientist and made as great a contribution to physics as Albert Einstein did. I'm not justifying that, but it's interesting that most of us know Einstein, most of us wouldn't know Dirac if we'd heard his name. So why is that? And obviously Einstein is a fantastic scientist, special theory of relativity, general theory of relativity, all that sort of stuff. But I think one of the reasons he's so amazingly credible is because of the way he presents himself or presented himself and the way he communicated. And particularly, he communicated in a way which was very, very relevant to people. You know, he was a very engaging sort of person. But if you listen to the sorts of ways he describes his work, he'll talk about things like, you know, viewing people on a passing train, or most famously, his analogy of sitting on a beam of light. And how would the world look if I sat on a beam of light? And this is an extremely appealing sort of thing. And it's appealing because it means something to us. And actually, there lies the secret of being perceived to be credible, is the fact that you can present your experience and your knowledge in a way that is meaningful to your audience. So it's one of those things that there is a real ground for credibility, and then there is this way clients perceive us, and clients' interpretation of how credible we are does rely on the way we communicate to them. So if you kind of think about that, Einstein versus Dirac, and if you've never heard of Paul Dirac, he is worth reading about. It's a very interesting guy, very odd and peculiar person, but a brilliant scientist. This ability to communicate and share your expertise in a way that clients appreciate and understand is fundamentally. And if you kind of look at your own experience, there are very, very few what I might bundle as trusted advisors, which is my sort of catch-all phrase for sort of consultants, coaches, people who people go to who they really trust. Very few of them who are poor communicators. But conversely, there are very few poor communicators who are real trusted advisors. Now, there aren't none, because sometimes if it's a very esoteric piece of expertise, we sometimes, you know, almost expect that slightly bizarre way of communicating. But generally in our work, that's not true. And the way we communicate is fundamentally important to it. So, I mean, I've got two things, you know, that then to add on that. So how do we do this? How might we do this? Before I get to that, just one of the things I would say is most of the time when we worry about improving our credibility, we do focus on, you know, those things like our track record and have I got enough experiences of N and enough experiences Y. We focus less on how am I going to present that experience to the clients, and yet that is what their perception is based on. So what is good about what are good ways of communicating expertise in ways that are helpful to clients? And I think, you know, none of this is rocket science, but I mean, the first thing is that if we're communicating on expertise, let's kind of use language and approaches that clients understand. And back to that Einstein traveling on a beam of light, which I think is a lovely image, and you know, which means something to us. Whereas if you look at the equations of the general and special theory of relativity, I think they would be completely meaningless to most of us, are certainly meaningless to me. Maybe there is a theoretical physicist on this call, but they're pretty difficult. So this idea of using analogies and stories and things that mean something to our clients is particularly strong. But there's a second point as well, is generally, not always, because everybody wants to be communicated in a specific way, but generally, if you look on average, the other thing is about communicating simply. You know, once we've got a degree of expertise in an area, it's very easy to share all that expertise and show our clients that the world is complicated. Yes, the world is complicated. Now there is a kind of old-fashioned saying that sort of goes along the ways. If you understand something, you can explain it simply, and if you can't explain it simply, you don't really understand it. Now I don't believe that. I think that's actually not true. But what is certainly true is if you can't explain it simply, you won't be perceived as understanding it. So, and again, we're back to that issue of perception and client's perception when it comes to credibility. So there's a thing about using things like analogies, using stories. I know Dave Chatham always talks about the narrative, the client narrative. That has many values, but one of them is also that in doing that, you present yourselves as credible because you presented something, a story the client can get their head around. But the other thing is being brief and looking to reduce complexity for our clients. Occasionally you'll meet a client who wants to know all the complexity, but most people want us as experts to pinpoint the points that are relevant to them. So reducing the complexity, and then all those good things about clarity, meaningfulness, and relevance to the specific situation. So, you know, that's pretty much it for me on credibility. But go back to, it's important to us. We don't get in the door with clients if we're not credible. We also can't do our work if we are not thought of as credible. It's an uncomfortable place to be on a client when the client is doubting our credibility. We are made credible by competence and our ability to apply that competence, and that's, if you like, what makes us deserve to be credible. But back to this point, the gap between what we deserve and what the clients perceive, and that perception is largely based on the way we are able to share our expertise and the way we are largely able to communicate it. And if you're wanting to increase your credibility with your clients, don't just focus on the track record and the badges and things like that. Think about how you explain what you do to your clients and how you put it in ways that are meaningful to them. And that will do as much to help your credibility as actually looking at and improving your actual real track record. That was it, a rapid talk through on credibility. I think we've got about 10 minutes if we want to get into some chit chat. And by the way, I'm happy to take questions, but I'm also happy for people to throw up alternatives and things like that. I think see these things as much as discussions as people firing questions to me.
So Richard, thanks for that. Just one observation for me. There seem to be, so like I'm in the very low badge camp. Yeah, I don't really want to collect badges for their own sake. But I do know people who seem to collect a lot of badges, and they, you know, you look at their LinkedIn and they have lots and lots of different, whatever it is, you know, Myers-Briggs, various different psychometrics, coaching qualifications, and so on. Do you think there might be a case of too many, you know, somebody being over-badged?
So I think, John, to me, and this my view is, there are some specific situations where you actually need a badge. So there are some specific situations where you're not allowed to do something unless you have the associated accreditation. So something like Myers-Briggs, I mean, I think we've all got a view, positive or negative, on Myers-Briggs, but unless you've got Myers-Briggs accreditation, you're not really supposed to do it. So there are some situations you need it. But yes, for me, to answer your specific question, do I think you can have too many badges? Yeah, I kind of do think you can do. And I sort of look, rightly or wrongly, slightly, you know, when somebody's got 1,000 badges after their name, it sort of slightly smacks of desperation, if I'm completely honest. But that's a personal perception. I've never tested that with clients. Yeah.
I also think a badge doesn't make you an instant expert. That's, you know, that perception might be out there. I don't have that view, but I see people that get qualifications and they think they're immediately an expert, whereas the reality is, real hands-on experience makes you the expert, not a badge. I wonder if that's something you've come across.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would generally agree with that. We all know that, you know, I think most people here will have done a degree. Frankly, when I came out of university with my qualifications, I was about as useful practically as a chocolate teapot. And it's, you know, perhaps I'm just a particularly impractical person, but I don't think my degree actually taught me anything practically useful. It was engineering was my core study, and I didn't choose to be an engineer, so that might be part of the drive. But yeah, you know, most of the really important things, but also particularly those things about, you know, communicating our experience so in a way that's helpful to client, that comes from experience, I think, more than what you've done. I don't want to belittle qualifications altogether, and I don't want to belittle accreditations altogether, because I think there is an important place for them, and certainly but there are limits, and certainly, you know, for all of us, certainly in PIC, where we work often in the project space, do I really care whether anybody's got any project accreditations or not? Personally, I don't. I'm pretty much only interested in track record of delivery. I'm not interested at all in any qualifications. Now, that again, that may just be me, but I've never in 30 years, more than 30 years of work, had a client ask me to walk through my accreditations or qualifications.
Richard, it's an interesting one as well, because obviously I see lots of CVs coming through at Partners in Change, and you know, it never surprises me the number of CVs I see which are just a long list of accreditations, and you know, you have to really get to about page 4 or 5 before you're starting to see actual experience, and you know, it's frustrating, because that's, on the whole, that's what I'm looking for. What people do. So that first step into even actually getting into a conversation with a potential client and getting some credibility, you know, it's they're struggling from the off.
The only thing I would add is I do think there's a cultural thing here. So I think in other countries there may be different attitudes to this. Yeah. So I think there's a very UK thing. My father-in-law, who was a Polish academic, he could never understand how I could work in one field but have a degree in another. To him, that was just, he could not get that. He just thought that was completely bizarre. And so I think that this may be a particularly British thing, this sort of slight disdain for qualifications. Having said that, you know, clients are looking for experience generally, certainly in our fields. Yeah.
Richard, I just wanted to comment that credibility isn't universal. Just because you're credible in one field, I mean, I think quite credible in payments and banking, but I wouldn't want to talk about a retail environment or nuclear physics or anything. So I think you have to be aware of the limits of your competence and not feign credibility in an area where you're not. I think that's as dangerous as anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is an interesting thing there. I think you're right, Nancy. We shouldn't be sort of stretching our skills beyond where they're due. But actually, from a client's perspective, and I think we'll have all found this, if we've done good work for a client in one area, they often do ask us to help them in other areas, because maybe they shouldn't, but they kind of build that perception of us as credible, and it's an interesting one. And I think there is a challenge then about when you say to the client, you know what, I'm not the person for this.
And I think I've said that a number of times, that's not my, you know, I'm not the right person for this, because I don't think you know, personally, I don't think I can succeed in it, because you know, the specialism is not my specialism. I don't have the deep technical knowledge for that. And I think it's more honest and more credible to say, no, I'm not the right person, but let me find someone for you.
Neil?
Yeah, I was once in a job doing software testing, which is what I've done a lot of, and the configuration manager, I was finishing a piece of work and the configuration manager had some kind of nervous breakdown, and I was asked to take over, and I said, no, I don't know much about configuration management. And he took me down the pub and asked me again, and you know, eventually I did it, and you know, I did it quite successfully, but I could never again get a job as a configuration management person because I didn't have all the appropriate tools. I'd just say another interesting thing about badges. I mean, in my experience, yeah, I agree with, I think Richard said that you can definitely be over badged, and the people that have long lists of fellow of BCS or whatever, it definitely looks like desperation. Peculiarly, there are 3 groups of qualifications, and they're like religious factions that hate each other. So if you've got the traditional software testing qualifications, you will actually not get a job as a context-driven tester, because they consider that experience to be almost evil. And similarly, if you've got agile experience, you might not get a job as a context-driven tester. So there are kind of 3 completely different factions. Obviously that's just software testing, but I don't know if that applies in any of your areas at all, that you can actually have the wrong kind of qualification.
Yeah, well, I can only talk for myself. I certainly know that I originally wrote about project management, and certainly when I'm in agile context, kind of anybody who looks me up and looks at the project management books of it, their eyes slightly roll and assume that I can't possibly know anything about agile because I'm some old dinosaur from the bygone era of linear developments that took forever and possibly never worked, which obviously isn't true, but yeah, I mean, those perceptions of different categories of things are there. That's an interesting topic in its own right.
Richard,
yeah,
there are some hands up. I think Kathy was first.
Sorry, yeah, can't. Yeah, hi, Kathy.
And Mark is after her. Yes.
I'm just interested in what people think about vulnerability versus credibility. So there's a lot of talk at the moment, has been for a couple of years after Brene Brown's TED talk, about the importance of vulnerability and how that creates connection between people and how important connection is. But it can be quite difficult to demonstrate credibility and vulnerability at the same time. So I'm just interested in Richard's thoughts and anybody else's thoughts around that.
Well, I mean, interesting. I think it relates to the topic that we've just had. I mean, I think from our field, often vulnerability is about saying what you don't know about as well as that. I mean, and I do think there is a difference between hiring the relevance of vulnerability in hiring somebody like ourselves as an external to come in to do a particular job versus somebody who's an employee or brought in to do there. So I think vulnerability and credibility, they are kind of context specific when they are there. But I do think the world has changed a lot in this. And certainly if you'd asked me 20, 30 years ago, as a let's give ourselves a broad brush term, experts, I think showing vulnerability was much less acceptable than I think it's become now. But I'm certainly, it's not something I'm deeply thinking. The only thing I would say is when we get on to trust as opposed to credibility, trust is related to credibility, but trust also requires a degree of a certain type of vulnerability anyway, certainly a certain sort of personal disclosure side of vulnerability.
Mm.
But it's not a topic I would claim to have any deep expertise in.
I think the problem is for external consultants in particular, vulnerability is incredibly difficult because there is this view that if I allow myself to be vulnerable, then I'm not going to be credible. And the client isn't going to believe that I can do the job. And I certainly, when I was at Lloyd's, I worked with a bunch of Accenture consultants and we did a huge amount of work on personal development as a team. And I always included all of the contractors and all of the consultants in that because they were part of the team. And I remember one of the Accenture guys coming up to me in the break and saying, I can't really participate in this because I can't share with you the things that make me vulnerable. And, and I said to him, that's exactly what we need you to share because that's how you're going to connect with the people here. Because they see, the Accenture guys as standoffish, arrogant, and all of those things. So I think it's interesting.
Mm. Yeah, I think you'll find that the different firms probably had different attitudes towards that as well, in the sense of the different. Again, when we talk about the big firms, again, we're not just into the individual, but into their sort of particular corporate cultures. And I think we all know Accenture had a particular culture which was a little bit different from some of the others.
Yeah.
Richard, I'm a bit
Mark,
time.
Yeah.
So I would like to give Mark a chance to ask or comment.
It was just more of an observation, Richard, rather than a necessary response needed. When I've been supporting clients, particularly the senior clients, with interviews, one thing I've noticed that I always find a little bit disappointing, actually, they tend to place value on common network connections and almost perceive that as credibility, even when a candidate may be credentializing what they're doing really well with your definitions, they're clear, crisp, and bring it to life. And you sit there, and I spend my time trying to convince the client, no, actually, you don't want that person just because they know Fred, because that doesn't prove they know what they're doing. It's a useful connection. And it's sort of, I find the network bit gets often confused and blurred into the credibility piece. Now, I know they're connected, but it's an interesting dynamic, I see.
I will briefly comment, because I think you very soon get into an interesting whole area there about, you know, people being in my group and in group and out of group, and actually, you know, that's how that all plays into things like diversity and stuff like that. So I think there's a very, very interesting topic there. It's not an angle I'd thought on it before, but I think you're right, Mark. Yeah.
Shall we call it a meeting? Thank you everyone for attending this.